If someone asked Evan about the moment he knew he would love someone more than his own life, he wouldn't talk about a first love or a warm summer night's kiss. He would talk about a cold morning in a neonatal ICU where the only sounds were the rhythmic hiss of ventilators and the glaring white light washing over a fragile being, fighting to survive. Oliver was born too early, too small, unprepared for the harshness of the world. And Evan, just 23 at the time, held his son for the first time and felt no fear. Only the overwhelming certainty that he belonged to this tiny life in his arms. When the doctors hesitated to give Oliver a chance, Evan leaned down and whispered into the humid warmth of the incubator, "No matter what happens, I will never leave you." Life didn't offer Evan much choice. His young wife, crushed under the weight of postpartum depression, began to pull away from both of them. A year after Oliver's birth, she left for good, signing away custody and walking out of their lives. Evan stayed a young man with trembling hands and a steadfast heart, working double shifts to pay for formula, rent, hospital bills. Whatever it took to keep that tiny promise alive. He worked as an electrician by day and waited tables by night. Every dollar earned a silent prayer for a future he barely dared to imagine. Friends moved on, built families, lived lives that seemed effortless. By comparison, Evan folded every dream he ever had into a small, battered box labeled Oliver. He sacrificed without regret. Behind every camping trip, every scraped knee, bandaged, every late-night science project, Evan kept a secret tucked tightly inside the truth of who he was, not because he was ashamed, but because he feared that any difference in him might someday crack the fragile world he had built for Oliver. In a town like theirs, where whispers traveled faster than light, being different wasn't just dangerous, it was a risk he couldn't afford. Oliver grew up never questioning his father's love. In every lunch packed, every cheer from the bleachers, every tear wiped away, Evan showed him what devotion looked like. They were a team, a fortress against the indifference of the world. Evan wasn't rich, he wasn't perfect, but not once did he let Oliver doubt that he was loved beyond measure. The years crept by, carving faint lines at the corners of Evan's eyes. Lines not from age, but from every fever he stayed up, nursing every school performance. He left work early to catch every heartbreak he patched up with whispered encouragements. He loved Oliver with a quiet fierceness that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. Yet somewhere deep inside, Evan wondered if he had traded too much of himself for the safety of silence. Would the boy he had raised with so much love still look at him the same if he knew the full truth? Evan had lived like that for 11 long years. Until one brittle autumn afternoon when a pair of kind brown eyes cracked his world wide open. Thomas, the first man who didn't make Evan feel like he had to apologize for existing, the first man who made him believe that maybe, just maybe, he was allowed to be whole. And for the first time in a long time, Evan thought maybe it was time to honor the promise he made not only to Oliver, but to himself. If you've ever loved someone so deeply that you gave up pieces of yourself without hesitation, join Heart Stories as we follow this journey. A journey not just for acceptance, but for learning that true love sometimes begins with loving yourself first. The decision to tell Oliver didn't come lightly. It brewed inside Evan for months, curling around the edges of every quiet evening and every lonely sunrise. After meeting Thomas, after feeling for the first time in more than a decade that it was possible to be seen and still be loved, Evan knew he couldn't live the rest of his life buried in silence. Not after everything he had promised himself, not after everything he had promised Oliver. It was a Sunday afternoon when Evan finally found the courage. The sky outside was muted, the light filtering through the windows in pale gold streaks. Oliver sat on the couch, hunched over a tablet, earbuds, and Evan sat down across from him, feeling the weight of 1,000 unsaid words pressing on his chest. His hands trembled slightly as he cleared his throat. Oliver pulled one earbud out, looked up with mild curiosity, the kind that only children who trust implicitly can offer. Evan's voice cracked and once then steadied, weaving through a halting confession about Thomas, about the man who made him smile again. He didn't use complicated words. He didn't talk about labels or politics. He just spoke the truth from one heart to another. The moment he finished, the silence that filled the room was colder than any winter Evan had ever known. Oliver's face went blank, the light in his eyes flickering out like a candle snuffed by a sudden gust. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply said, in a voice flat and final, "I don't want you to be like that." Then he stood up, earbuds still dangling, and walked into his bedroom, closing the door behind him without a sound. Evan sat frozen, feeling the hollow ache of a father who had just lost something irreplaceable, but couldn't even name it yet. The weeks that followed felt like a slow suffocation. Oliver stopped coming home after school. He spent his afternoons and nights at his grandparents' house. Evan knew, without asking, that it wasn't just about convenience. His own father-in-law, a man who had barely spoken more than a few civil words to Evan over the years, now sent curt-clipped messages offering to keep Oliver out of confusion. Thanksgiving came and went with an empty chair at Evan's table. December wrapped the town in sparkling lights and festive music, but inside Evan's house, the only sound was the buzz of the heater and the tick of the old wall clock. He had bought Oliver gifts like always. Thoughtful ones, a new baseball mitt, the art set he had mentioned months ago, but none of them were unwrapped. They sat in a neat pile under a tree Evan decorated alone. On Christmas morning, Evan made coffee, sat in the worn armchair by the window, and stared at the street outside where other families carried bags of gifts and pies, where children in new coats clutched their parents' hands and laughed under their breath in the cold air. Evan sat there for hours waiting for the sound of a knock, the jingle of keys in the door. Anything that would tell him Oliver had changed his mind. Nothing came by the time New Year's Eve arrived. Evan wasn't even pretending anymore. Thomas came by that evening offering a warm smile and a quiet presence. They didn't kiss. They didn't even hold hands. They sat a respectful distance apart, two people trying not to take up too much space in a house filled with grief. Evan felt grateful and guilty all at once. At midnight, Evan watched the fireworks explode in brilliant, reckless colors over the town square and thought about promises, about the one he made beside an incubator so many years ago, about the one he had just made to himself to live honestly. No matter the cost, he wondered bitterly whether it was possible to keep both. The first week of January, Oliver came back. He didn't say why. He didn't apologize. He simply showed up, dropped his backpack by the door and said he needed to be home for school. Evan didn't press. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and set a plate at the table for dinner, like nothing had happened, like everything hadn't changed forever. But it had, the boy. Evan had raised the boy who used to run into his arms after soccer games, now sat stiffly across from him, answering questions with shrugs or one-word sentences. Evan found himself second-guessing every movement, every glance. He stopped mentioning Thomas altogether. He stopped smiling too much. He stopped being himself. It wasn't just loss, it was erasure. Evan loved his son enough to let him hate him, loved him enough to swallow every bitter word. Oliver never said aloud, but every time Oliver flinched when Thomas's name came up, or when he refused to join them for a simple outing, Evan felt another thread snap inside his chest. He had thought that coming out would be the hardest part, that surviving the loneliness of Christmas would be the test, but the real agony was living day after day in the ruins of what used to be, trying not to let the walls fall completely apart. Still somewhere deep beneath the hurt, Evan clung stubbornly to hope. The same hope that had kept him by Oliver's side in a sterile hospital room all those years ago. The hope that love, real, fierce, patient love, could survive even this. Because if it couldn't, then what had all the sacrifices ever been for? The tension between Evan and Oliver settled like dust over everything impossible to ignore, no matter how hard Evan tried. Some nights he would hear Oliver's soft footsteps in the hall, a reminder that his son still lived under his roof, even if the spirit that once bound them together seemed to have slipped away. Other nights, Evan would sit alone at the kitchen table, tracing the rim of his coffee cup with a fingertip, wondering if the boy upstairs hated him, or worse, felt nothing at all. It wasn't long before the outside world found a way to wedge itself deeper into the cracks between them. One afternoon, Evan's phone rang. It was his former father-in-law, a man he had barely spoken to in years, except through obligatory nods at school functions or strained holiday gatherings. His voice when Evan answered was clipped and sharp. "We need to talk about Oliver," he said without preamble. "He needs stability. He needs to be around normal influences." The words hung there sour and heavy. Evan gripped the phone tighter, feeling his knuckles pale. "He's already confused enough as it is," the man continued. "Living with you, it's not healthy for him. I'm offering him a place to stay, a real home, one that won't embarrass him." The call ended without Evan saying much at all. He didn't trust himself to speak, afraid that the anger boiling beneath his ribs would spill out in a way he couldn't take back. That night, Evan found Oliver at the dinner table staring blankly at a textbook. The boy's shoulders were tense, his mouth drawn in a tight line. Evan sat down across from him, the chair creaking under his weight. "You talked to Grandpa," Oliver said without looking up. It wasn't a question. Evan nodded even though the boy wasn't watching. "He says I can move in with them if I want." The room seemed to tilt sideways. Evan fought the urge to grab Oliver's by the shoulders to plead to demand. Instead, he said very quietly, "Is that what you want?" For a long moment, Oliver said nothing. Then he shrugged a small, indifferent gesture that hurt more than any shouted word could have. Evan sat there long after Oliver had gone back upstairs, the untouched dinner cooling on the plates. The weeks blurred together. Evan found himself waking every morning with a knot in his stomach, dreading the silence, dreading the looks. He tried to pretend he didn't notice when Oliver packed overnight bags more frequently, when he stayed longer at his grandparents' house each weekend. Every time Oliver left, it felt like Evan was losing another piece of him, like sand slipping through desperate fingers. Then came the night when everything broke. It had started like any other strained evening. Evan had asked cautiously if Oliver wanted to join him and Thomas for dinner at a new restaurant. It wasn't a big ask. They wouldn't hold hands. They wouldn't even sit too close. Just three people sharing a meal. Oliver's face darkened immediately. "I'm not going anywhere with you two," he muttered, shoving his chair back. Evan stood too quickly, hard hammering. "Oliver, please, I'm still your father. I'm still—" "No, you're not." Oliver shouted, his voice cracking with the rawness of it. "You're some guy who decided to be gross. You're not the dad I used to have." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. Oliver stormed toward the door. Evan moved instinctively to block him, not to trap him, but to reach him, to say something, anything that could pull him back. But before he could speak, Oliver spat the words that would haunt Evan for the rest of his life. "I wish you hadn't saved me. I wish you had let me die when I was born." Silence slammed into the room like a hurricane ripping the air from Evan's lungs. Oliver shoved past him and was gone, the door slamming so hard the windows rattled in their frames. Evan stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where his son had been. His body felt too heavy to move, his heart too shattered to beat properly. He didn't cry, not at first. He simply sank down onto the floor, leaning his forehead against the cool wood, and let the broken pieces of himself scatter around him. Thomas arrived an hour later, letting himself in quietly. He found Evan still sitting there, surrounded by the wreckage of the evening. Thomas didn't say anything. He didn't try to offer hollow words of comfort. He simply sat down beside Evan, close enough that Evan could feel his warmth, far enough that Evan didn't feel suffocated. It wasn't sympathy Evan needed. It was presence. It was the simple, stubborn fact of not being abandoned when everything inside him screamed that he deserved to be alone. At some point, Evan leaned his head back against the wall and whispered into the darkness, "What if he never forgives me?" Thomas's answer was soft, steady. "Then we love him anyway." Evan didn't know if he had the strength for that kind of unconditional love, but he knew he had no choice. Loving Oliver wasn't something he could turn off. It wasn't something he could withdraw, like a hand burned by rejection. It was woven into the very marrow of who he was. In the days that followed, Evan went through the motions of living. Even as grief hollowed him out from the inside, he left the porch light on every night. He charged Oliver's phone even when the boy wasn't there to use it. He cooked too much food, set too many plates just in case Oliver walked through the door and decided to stay. Hope, it turned out, was the cruelest form of devotion, and yet Evan clung to it the way a drowning man clings to driftwood, not because he was certain it would save him, but because letting go simply wasn't an option. Because even when love costs everything, some promises are too sacred to break. The house remained eerily silent after Oliver's departure, every corner echoing with the absence of footsteps Evan had once taken for granted. The untouched plate of dinner on the table, the abandoned backpack by the door, the fading warmth from the slam of the door. These became Evan's only companions that night. Morning came reluctantly, dragging gray light through the windows. Evan barely moved. He sat at the edge of the couch, phone clutched tightly in one hand, staring at it as if willing it to ring. It didn't. Every hour that passed gnawed deeper into his soul, carving spaces where fear and regret took root. By midday, Thomas arrived again, silent and steady as ever. Evan didn't need to explain anything. The grief hung between them like smoke. It was Thomas who suggested they go look for Oliver, not with frantic calls or desperate searches, just a quiet drive through the places Oliver loved. The baseball field, the old park with the rusted swings, the corner store where Evan used to buy him ice cream after little league games, not to chase, not to corner, but simply to be there if he needed them. They drove through the town in a slow, aching loop. Evan kept glancing out the window, half hoping, half terrified of what he might find. It was Thomas who noticed first, the small figure sitting alone, high up in the bleachers at the town's abandoned baseball field. Evan's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but Thomas gently placed a hand over his. No rushing, no overwhelming. Evan pulled over and parked without a word. Thomas stepped out first, moving with the quiet caution of someone approaching a wounded animal. Evan stayed back for a moment, heart hammering against his ribs, before finally following at a distance. From where they stood at the edge of the field, Oliver looked impossibly small against the vast, empty backdrop of the stadium. His knees were pulled to his chest, his chin tucked down, his body wrapped tight like he could shield himself from the world by sheer will. Thomas didn't call out, didn't climb the bleachers. He simply sat down on the grass, a respectful distance away, facing the same direction Oliver did. Evan stayed further back, a silent sentinel. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The winter air bit at their skin, but no one moved, no one spoke. It was Oliver who finally broke the silence. His voice floated down on the cold wind, barely louder than a whisper. "Why did you come?" Thomas didn't look at him, didn't smile or soften his voice into something patronizing. He just answered simple and steady, as if stating a fact. "Because you matter." Oliver didn't respond immediately. He curled tighter into himself, as if bracing against the words. For a long time, Evan thought that might be it. That Oliver would stay silent, that he would retreat even further behind his wall of hurt. But then in a voice so raw it barely held together, Oliver asked, "Do you hate me?" Thomas didn't hesitate. No. No lectures, no explanations. Just that one word dropped gently into the frozen air between them. Oliver buried his face in his knees. His shoulders trembled once, a small, involuntary motion before he stilled again. Thomas didn't push. He didn't climb the bleachers to pull Oliver into an embrace he wasn't ready for. He simply remained there, solid, unwavering. A silent promise that rejection wouldn't drive him away. After a long while, Oliver stood up, legs stiff from the cold. He didn't look at Thomas. He didn't look at Evan, who still stood frozen by the fence. He just began to walk toward the car, each step slow but certain. Evan hurried ahead to open the passenger door. Oliver slid in without a word, hugging his arms around himself. Thomas drove, keeping the heater turned high, but the radio off. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't crushing either. It was a beginning. A space being cleared for something new to grow at home. Oliver went straight to his room. Evan stood in the living room, arms hanging limply at his sides, feeling the weight of everything unsaid pressing against his chest. But that night, just before midnight, Evan found something small, but extraordinary. A note slipped under his bedroom door. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a full reconciliation. It was just a crumpled piece of notebook paper torn hastily from a binder with 5 words scrawled in messy, familiar handwriting. "Thanks for not giving up." Evan sat on the edge of his bed, holding the note like it was made of glass. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to hope without reservation. Maybe the road ahead would still be hard. Maybe there would be more slammed doors and bitter words. But somewhere inside his son, the light that had always been there, the light Evan had fought for since the day Oliver was born, was still burning. Sometimes the first step toward healing isn't an apology or a dramatic reunion. Sometimes it's just a quiet return, a willingness to be seen again. And Evan, who had learned long ago that love was an act of endurance more than emotion, knew he would meet his son wherever he was again and again for as long as it took. If you believe that even the smallest crack can let the light back in, keep walking with us. The days after Oliver's return unfolded cautiously like footsteps on thin ice. Evan didn't push. He didn't ask questions about where Oliver had gone or what had shifted inside him. He simply showed up in every quiet breakfast, shared at the counter, in every silent car ride to school, in every moment that required patience rather than answers. At first, the changes were almost imperceptible. Oliver no longer recoiled when Thomas entered a room. He still didn't seek him out. Still kept a distance that was measurable, but he didn't stiffen or frown the way he had before. Sometimes Evan caught him glancing sideways at Thomas as if trying to reconcile the man who had come to find him at the stadium with the version he had built in his mind, the version shaped by fear, by anger, by other people's voices. One evening, as Evan was fixing a leaky kitchen faucet, Oliver hovered by the door, fidgeting with the hem of his sweatshirt. After a long pause, he spoke, voice tight but determined. Thomas knows how to fix stuff, right? Evan paused, heart thudding for reasons that had nothing to do with the faucet. He wiped his hands on a towel and turned. Yeah, he said simply. Oliver nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then disappeared down the hall. It wasn't much. It wasn't an invitation, but it was a crack in the wall, and Evan knew better than to underestimate the power of small openings. Over the next few weeks, Oliver's thaw continued, slow but real. He accepted a ride from Thomas without protest. He sat through a family dinner where Thomas was present, eyes focused determinedly on his plate but not walking away. He even once answered Thomas's question about school with more than a grunt. The real shift came on a rainy Saturday afternoon. Oliver's baseball team had planned a practice game, but the field flooded and everything was canceled last minute. Evans suggested a movie night at home, just the three of them. He held his breath as Oliver considered, finally with a sigh that spoke more of teenage reluctance than rejection. Oliver muttered, "Okay." They watched an old action movie Evan remembered loving when he was Oliver's age. Halfway through, during a particularly ridiculous stunt scene, Oliver laughed, a real unguarded laugh. Evan looked over and saw Thomas smiling too, not at the screen, but at Oliver. But in that moment, Evan understood something profound. Thomas wasn't trying to replace anyone or fix what was broken. He was simply offering what he had. Patience, steadiness, a quiet kind of loyalty that asked for nothing in return. And somehow Oliver had begun to see it as the credits rolled and the storm outside deepened. Oliver didn't bolt for his room. Instead, he stayed, pulling a blanket tighter around his shoulders, yawning without apology. Evan felt something loosen inside his chest, a knot of grief beginning finally to unravel. Weeks later, at a small birthday dinner Thomas organized for Evan, a modest gathering with pizza and a lopsided homemade cake, Oliver handed him a card. It was nothing elaborate, just a folded piece of printer paper, the kind a kid grabs last minute. But inside, in his messy handwriting, were the words that Evan would treasure more than anything. "Thanks for always showing up, even when I didn't." Evan closed his eyes for a moment, the card trembling slightly in his hands. Love, he realized, was never about being accepted immediately. It wasn't about proving oneself worthy. It was about standing there day after day, heart, open hands, steady, even when the world said you should walk away. It was about staying. And Evan, who had stayed through loneliness, through rejection, through the fear of losing everything, finally felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months: peace. The road ahead wouldn't be perfect. There would be disagreements, setbacks, moments of doubt, but the foundation was there now. Not of perfection, but of perseverance. And sometimes that's enough, because real love, the kind worth fighting for, never asks for permission to exist, it simply does. If you've ever believed that healing isn't a straight line, but 1,000 small steps toward each other, we'd love to hear from you. Has there ever been a moment when someone's quiet, steady love changed your heart? Share your story in the comments below. You never know who might need to read it today. And if Evan's journey touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Heart Stories. We believe every broken road can lead somewhere beautiful, and we're honored to walk that road with you.